Over 47 million people have now watched the exact moment when attorney Jasmine Rodriguez stood up in a Manhattan courtroom and shattered Whoopi Goldberg's carefully constructed world with just 7 words. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. The case was meant to be a simple contract dispute, a quiet settlement behind closed doors. But when Jasmine opened that manila envelope and pulled out a document that wasn't supposed to exist, everything changed. The judge's gavel froze midair. Whoopi's million-dollar legal team went silent. And the words that came out of Jasmine's mouth sent shockwaves through the entertainment industry that are still reverberating today. The courtroom had seen its share of celebrity cases, but nothing like this. Room 304 in the New York Supreme Court building had hosted divorce battles, custody fights, and contract disputes for decades. The mahogany benches had witnessed tears, rage, and carefully rehearsed apologies. But on this Tuesday morning in October, the air felt different. Electric. Dangerous. Media representatives filled the back rows, their cameras trained on the defendant's table, where Whoopi sat in a charcoal gray suit, her trademark confidence intact. She'd been through legal battles before. She knew how to handle lawyers, judges, and public scrutiny. At least, she thought she did. Jasmine Rodriguez wasn't what anyone expected. While Whoopi's legal team consisted of 3 Harvard-educated attorneys in $1,000 suits, Jasmine sat alone at the plaintiff's table. She was young, maybe 35, with her dark hair pulled back in a simple bun and wearing a navy blazer that had seen better days. Her briefcase was worn leather, held together with a brass clasp that clicked when she opened it. But her eyes, those dark brown eyes that seemed to take in everything and give away nothing, held a certainty that made the expensive lawyers across the aisle shift uncomfortably in their seats. The case file read like a routine matter. Jasmine's client, a small production company, claimed Whoopi had breached a development deal for a talk show project. Standard Hollywood business. The damages sought were minimal, barely worth Whoopi's time. Her legal team had prepared for a quick dismissal, maybe a small settlement to make the whole thing disappear. They'd dealt with nuisance lawsuits before. This was supposed to be Tuesday afternoon paperwork. But Jasmine had spent 3 years preparing for this moment, and she knew something that no one else in that courtroom knew. Something that would change everything. Judge Margaret Chen entered the courtroom with the practiced authority of someone who'd overseen thousands of cases. Her black robes rustled as she took her seat, and her sharp eyes surveyed the room with the efficiency of a hawk spotting prey. She'd read the briefs, reviewed the evidence, and expected this to be wrapped up before lunch. A simple contract dispute between a celebrity and a small company. She'd seen it all before. But when she looked at Jasmine Rodriguez, something in the young attorney's posture made her pause. There was a stillness about her, a coiled energy that suggested this case might not be as simple as it appeared. Whoopi's lead attorney, Charles Morrison, stood to deliver his opening statement. His voice was smooth, practiced, the kind of tone that had convinced juries and judges for 30 years. He spoke of frivolous lawsuits, of opportunistic companies trying to capitalize on celebrity status, of contracts that were never properly executed. He painted Jasmine's client as a desperate small company reaching for a payday they didn't deserve. The judge nodded politely. The media took notes. Whoopi smiled slightly, confident in her legal armor. Morrison sat down, satisfied that he'd just won the case before it really began. Then Jasmine stood up. She didn't rush to the podium or launch into a dramatic speech. Instead, she walked slowly to her briefcase, opened it with that distinctive brass clasp, and pulled out a manila envelope that hadn't been in any of the discovery materials. The envelope was thick, yellowed with age, and sealed with red wax that had been broken and resealed multiple times. She held it in her hands like it contained dynamite, which, in a way, it did. The courtroom was silent, but it was the kind of silence that precedes thunder. "Your Honor," Jasmine began, her voice steady and clear, "before we proceed with this case, there's something the court needs to see. Something that changes everything we thought we knew about this dispute." She walked toward the judge's bench, the envelope in her outstretched hand. This document was sealed for 23 years. It was never supposed to see the light of day. But the truth has a way of surfacing, even when powerful people try to bury it. Judge Chin took the envelope with curiosity turning to concern as she broke the remaining wax seal. Inside were photographs, contracts, and handwritten notes that made her eyebrows rise higher with each page. The silence in the courtroom stretched until it became uncomfortable. Whoopi's legal team exchanged glances. Morrison half rose from his chair, then sat back down, unsure whether to object to evidence he'd never seen. "Ms. Rodriguez," Judge Chin said slowly, "where did you obtain this material?" Jasmine's response was calm, measured, but it landed like a bomb. "From the private files of Vincent Harrington, Your Honor. The man who died 3 weeks ago and left instructions that these documents be delivered to my office if anything ever happened to him." The name Vincent Harrington hit the courtroom like a physical force. Morrison's face went pale. Whoopi's confident smile vanished completely. The media representatives in the back rows leaned forward, sensing that they were witnessing something much bigger than a simple contract dispute. Vincent Harrington had been one of Hollywood's most powerful agents, a man who'd built careers and destroyed them with equal efficiency. He'd also been Whoopi's agent for 15 years, and he'd taken secrets to his grave. Or so everyone thought. Judge Chun continued reading, her expression growing more serious with each page. Finally, she looked up at Jasmine with newfound respect and something that might have been amazement. "Counselor, are you prepared to authenticate these documents?" "I am, Your Honor. And I'm prepared to prove that this case isn't about a simple contract dispute. It's about a cover-up that's been hidden for over 2 decades. A cover-up that involves not just my client, but 3 other production companies, 2 major networks, and a conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of the entertainment industry." The courtroom erupted. Morrison jumped to his feet, shouting objections. Whoopi grabbed her lawyer's arm, whispering urgently. The media representatives were typing furiously on their phones. But through it all, Jasmine remained perfectly calm, watching the chaos unfold with the satisfaction of someone who'd just lit a very long fuse. But what no one in that courtroom realized was that the envelope Judge Chin was holding contained only a fraction of what Jasmine had uncovered. The real bombshell, the secret that would destroy careers and expose a web of lies that had been carefully maintained for decades, was still locked away in Jasmine's office safe. And she wasn't planning to reveal it until the perfect moment arrived. The judge banged her gavel 3 times before order was restored. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who realized she was no longer presiding over a simple lawsuit. "This court will recess for 1 hour while I review these materials. When we return, Ms. Rodriguez, you will have the opportunity to present your case. And I have a feeling it's going to be unlike anything this courtroom has ever seen." As the judge left the bench and the courtroom slowly emptied, Jasmine packed her briefcase with the same methodical precision she'd used to open it. She didn't look at Whoopi or her legal team. She didn't speak to the media representatives who were trying to catch her attention. She simply walked toward the exit, knowing that when court reconvened, she would begin to unravel a secret so explosive that it would change Hollywood forever. Because what she'd shown the judge was just the beginning, and the real revelation was about to turn Whoopi Goldberg's world upside down in ways that no one could have imagined. The truth was about to come out, and after 23 years of careful hiding, some secrets are powerful enough to destroy everything in their path. But the question that would keep viewers glued to their screens was this: what could possibly be so devastating that Vincent Harrington risked everything to keep it hidden? And why did he choose Jasmine Rodriguez to be the one to finally expose it? The 1-hour recess felt like an eternity, but it was nothing compared to the 23 years that had led to this moment. While Judge Chin sat in her chambers, methodically reviewing documents that weren't supposed to exist, 2 very different worlds were colliding in the corridors of justice. On one side stood Whoopi Goldberg, a woman who had built an empire on authenticity and truth-telling, now facing the possibility that her own truth might be exposed. On the other stood Jasmine Rodriguez, an attorney whose entire career had been leading to this single moment, carrying secrets that could reshape the entertainment industry forever. The hallway outside room 304 had become a battlefield disguised as polite conversation. Whoopi's legal team huddled in an alcove, their voices hushed but their panic barely contained. Charles Morrison, the lead attorney who had walked into court confident of an easy victory, now found himself staring at a case that had morphed into something unrecognizable. His 30 years of experience meant nothing when the rules of the game had suddenly changed. He'd built his reputation on knowing every angle, every precedent, every possible outcome. But Vincent Harrington's posthumous revelation had thrown him into uncharted territory. How is this possible? Morrison whispered to his associate, Sarah Chun, as they stood near the courthouse windows. Vincent died 3 weeks ago. His files were supposed to be sealed, destroyed. We had assurances. Sarah, a Harvard Law graduate who specialized in entertainment litigation, shook her head in disbelief. She'd known Vincent Harrington professionally for years. The man was legendary for his discretion, his ability to make problems disappear. The idea that he'd kept a detailed record of his most sensitive dealings was inconceivable. Yet here they were, facing evidence that suggested Vincent had been playing a much deeper game than anyone realized. Whoopi herself sat on a bench near the courtroom entrance, her trademark confidence replaced by something much more vulnerable. She'd been through legal battles before, weathered public storms, survived career setbacks. But this felt different. This felt personal. Vincent had been more than her agent. He'd been her confidant, her protector, the man who had helped her navigate the treacherous waters of Hollywood success. If he had truly kept records of their private dealings, if he had documented the choices they'd made together, then everything she'd built could crumble in a matter of hours. Meanwhile, Jasmine Rodriguez sat alone in a small conference room down the hall, surrounded by boxes of files that told a story spanning decades. She wasn't celebrating or gloating. Instead, she was methodically organizing evidence with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. Each document, each photograph, each recorded conversation had been carefully cataloged and cross-referenced. This wasn't about winning a lawsuit for her. This was about justice that had been delayed for over 2 decades. The story had begun long before Jasmine ever became a lawyer. It started in 1999 when she was just 12 years old, living in a small apartment in Queens with her mother, Maria Rodriguez. Maria had been a script supervisor, one of the countless behind-the-scenes professionals who kept Hollywood productions running smoothly. She'd worked on 3 major projects that year, including a television pilot that was supposed to change her life. The show never aired, the production company folded overnight, and Maria found herself blacklisted from an industry she devoted her life to. What 12-year-old Jasmine didn't know at the time was that her mother had witnessed something on that set, something that powerful people needed to keep quiet. Maria had been in the wrong place at the right time, and she'd seen a conversation that wasn't meant for her ears. She'd watched as promises were made and broken, as careers were sacrificed to protect reputations, as truth was buried beneath layers of legal agreements and financial settlements. Maria had tried to speak up, tried to do the right thing, but she'd quickly learned that in Hollywood, some truths are more dangerous than lies. The production company that had employed Maria was owned by Vincent Harrington, though his name never appeared on any official documents. It was one of his side ventures, a way to develop projects outside the traditional studio system. When everything went wrong, when the scandal threatened to surface, Vincent had made the executive decision to shut everything down. The company disappeared, the records were sealed, and everyone involved was required to sign non-disclosure agreements that would follow them to their graves. Everyone, that is, except Maria Rodriguez. She'd refused to sign, refused to take the settlement money, refused to disappear quietly into the night. Her defiance had cost her everything. She'd been systematically excluded from future projects, her reputation destroyed through whisper campaigns and industry blacklisting. Within 6 months, she'd been forced to leave Hollywood entirely, moving back to New York with her young daughter and starting over in a different industry. But Maria had kept records. She'd documented every conversation, saved every email, recorded every phone call where someone had tried to buy her silence. She'd known that someday, somehow, the truth would need to come out. And she'd raised her daughter with the understanding that justice delayed is not justice denied, merely justice postponed until the right moment arrives. When Maria died of cancer 3 years ago, she'd left Jasmine more than just memories. She'd left her a mission. Hidden in their family storage unit were boxes of evidence that told the real story of what had happened on that television set in 1999. They contained proof of financial irregularities, evidence of systematic intimidation, and records of a cover-up that had reached the highest levels of the entertainment industry. Most importantly, they contained the names of everyone who had been involved, including some who had gone on to achieve fame and fortune while others had been silenced forever. Jasmine had spent the last 3 years preparing for this moment. She'd gotten her law degree, specialized in entertainment litigation, and built a practice that focused on representing the voices that Hollywood preferred to ignore. She'd learned patience, strategy, and the art of legal warfare. But most importantly, she'd learned that the most powerful weapon in any courtroom isn't emotion or drama. It's truth, carefully documented and methodically presented. The production company that was suing Whoopi was more than just Jasmine's client. It was a front, a carefully constructed legal entity that existed for one purpose: to bring this case to court and force the truth into the light. The contract dispute was real, but it was also a Trojan horse, a way to get discovery rights and subpoena power. Everything had been planned, every move calculated, every document strategically placed. Vincent Harrington's death had been the final piece of the puzzle. The old agent had carried his secrets for decades, but he'd also carried guilt. In his final weeks, as cancer consumed his body, he'd made one last moral choice. He'd contacted Jasmine through an intermediary, arranged for his private files to be delivered to her office, and given her the keys to unlock a conspiracy that had been carefully maintained for over 20 years. The documents that Judge Chun was reviewing in her chambers weren't just evidence of a business dispute. They were proof of a systematic campaign to silence witnesses, destroy evidence, and protect the careers of those who had been involved in something that should have destroyed them decades ago. They showed financial transactions that had no legitimate business purpose, legal agreements that were designed to hide rather than resolve, and most damning of all, recorded conversations where powerful people discussed how to make inconvenient truths disappear. As the courthouse clock struck 2 p.m., indicating that the recess was almost over, both sides prepared for a battle that would determine more than just the outcome of a single lawsuit. This was about whether the entertainment industry's most carefully guarded secrets could remain hidden, whether justice could be delayed indefinitely, and whether one woman's quest for truth could topple an empire built on lies. The courtroom doors opened, and spectators began filing back in. The media representatives had multiplied during the break, drawn by rumors of explosive revelations. Whoopi's legal team looked grim, their confidence shattered by an hour of frantic research into documents they'd never seen. And Jasmine Rodriguez sat calmly at her table, knowing that what she'd revealed so far was just the opening move in a game that had been 23 years in the making. But the real question that would keep viewers on the edge of their seats was this: if Vincent Harrington's death had provided the key to unlocking this conspiracy, what other secrets had he taken to his grave, and how many powerful people were about to discover that their carefully buried past was about to become their very public present? When Judge Chun returned to the bench, her expression had shifted from mild interest to intense focus. The documents she'd reviewed during the recess had clearly changed her understanding of the case, but she maintained the judicial composure that had defined her 20-year career. She adjusted her glasses, glanced at both legal teams, and spoke with the measured authority of someone who knew they were about to oversee something unprecedented. Court is back in session. Ms. Rodriguez, you may proceed with your opening statement. But before Jasmine could stand, Charles Morrison rose from his chair with the fluid confidence of a man who had spent 3 decades turning legal disasters into victories. Despite the shock of the mysterious envelope, he had used the recess to regroup, strategize, and prepare a defense that would neutralize whatever ammunition Jasmine thought she possessed. Morrison had built his reputation on being unshakable, and he wasn't about to let a young attorney with a collection of old documents destroy his most famous client. Your Honor, Morrison began, his voice carrying the smooth authority that had intimidated opponents for years. Before my esteemed colleague presents what I can only assume will be a dramatic interpretation of some very old paperwork, I feel it's crucial that this court understand the context of what we're dealing with here. He gestured toward Jasmine with the dismissive wave of someone brushing away an annoying insect. Ms. Rodriguez has spent considerable time and resources creating what amounts to an elaborate conspiracy theory based on documents that are decades old, taken completely out of context, and frankly, irrelevant to the simple contract dispute that brought us here today. Morrison walked toward the jury box. Even though this was a bench trial, his body language commanding attention from everyone in the courtroom. He'd learned long ago that legal victories were won as much through presence and confidence as through evidence and precedent. Vincent Harrington was a brilliant agent and a dear friend to my client. He was also a man who kept meticulous records of every business transaction, every negotiation, every deal that crossed his desk. The fact that he maintained extensive files doesn't indicate conspiracy, it indicates thoroughness. Whoopi sat perfectly still at the defendant's table, her hands folded in her lap, her expression carefully neutral. She'd been through media storms before, weathered public controversies, and survived career challenges that would have destroyed lesser celebrities. But watching Morrison work his magic in the courtroom, she felt a familiar comfort returning. This was what she'd paid for: protection, expertise, and the kind of legal firepower that could make inconvenient truths disappear. Morrison continued his performance, his voice rising with practiced indignation. What we're seeing here is an attempt to weaponize grief and confusion. Vincent Harrington passed away 3 weeks ago, and he's no longer here to provide context for these documents, to explain their true meaning, or to defend himself against implications that, frankly, border on character assassination. He paused, letting his words sink in before delivering what he clearly believed would be a devastating blow. It's convenient, isn't it, that these supposedly explosive revelations only surface after the one person who could refute them is safely in his grave? The courtroom was silent, but it was the kind of silence that suggested Morrison's words were landing exactly as intended. Several of the media representatives were nodding slightly, recognizing the logical appeal of his argument. Even Judge Chin seemed to be listening with renewed skepticism, her earlier amazement tempered by Morrison's methodical deconstruction of Jasmine's dramatic presentation. Furthermore, Morrison continued, warming to his theme, this court should consider the source of these allegations. Ms. Rodriguez didn't stumble upon this evidence through legitimate legal discovery. She didn't uncover these documents through proper investigative channels. Instead, she admits to receiving them from a dead man's private files, materials that were never meant to be public, never subjected to cross-examination, and never verified through proper legal procedures. Morrison walked back toward his table, his movement calculated to draw attention to the stark contrast between his team's professional setup and Jasmine's solitary presence. My client, Whoopi Goldberg, has built a career on honesty, integrity, and authentic communication. She's faced public scrutiny for decades, always with grace and transparency. The idea that she would be involved in some elaborate conspiracy to suppress the truth is not just unfounded, it's absurd. Whoopi allowed herself a small smile at this characterization. She'd worked hard to cultivate her image as someone who spoke truth to power, who wasn't afraid to tackle controversial subjects, who stood up for the underdog. Morrison was reminding the court and the watching world of exactly who she was supposed to be. The woman who had built her career on calling out hypocrisy and exposing uncomfortable truths couldn't possibly be guilty of suppressing them. But let's address the elephant in the room, Morrison said, his tone shifting to something more personal, more intimate. Ms. Rodriguez's mother, Maria Rodriguez, worked briefly for a production company that was associated with Vincent Harrington's business interests. Maria Rodriguez was a script supervisor who, according to these documents, refused to sign a standard non-disclosure agreement. She was subsequently not rehired for future projects. Morrison paused, his expression softening into something that might have been sympathy. Losing a job is painful. Being excluded from an industry you love is devastating. But it's not evidence of a conspiracy. It's evidence of a business decision, perhaps a personality conflict, maybe even a professional disagreement. The entertainment industry is notoriously difficult, and careers end abruptly for countless reasons that have nothing to do with cover-ups or systematic suppression. The subtext was clear. Maria Rodriguez had been a disgruntled employee who had invented a conspiracy to explain her professional failures. Her daughter was now trying to transform personal grievance into legal victory, using her mother's death as emotional leverage to support claims that wouldn't stand up to rational scrutiny. "My client has never met Maria Rodriguez," Morrison continued, his voice gaining strength. "She has no knowledge of whatever employment dispute may have occurred over 20 years ago. She certainly had no involvement in any decision to terminate Ms. Rodriguez's employment or exclude her from future projects. To suggest otherwise is not just legally baseless, it's morally reprehensible." Morrison moved toward the center of the courtroom, positioning himself as the sole barrier between truth and manipulation. What we're witnessing here is an attempt to use the legal system as a weapon of personal revenge. Ms. Rodriguez has constructed an elaborate narrative that places her deceased mother at the center of some grand conspiracy, with my client as the primary villain. But narrative is not evidence, and emotional appeals are not legal arguments. The courtroom was completely silent now, hanging on Morrison's every word. He'd managed to shift the entire focus of the case from whatever was in Vincent Harrington's files to the motivations and credibility of the woman who had obtained them. It was a masterful performance, the kind of legal maneuvering that had made him one of the most feared attorneys in entertainment law. Furthermore, Morrison said, building toward his conclusion, even if we accept every allegation in these documents as true, even if we assume that some business disputes occurred 23 years ago, what does that have to do with a contract dispute that brought us here today? The answer is nothing. Absolutely nothing. This is a desperate attempt to turn a simple breach of contract case into a sensational media event. Morrison returned to his table, his confidence radiating throughout the courtroom. My client entered into a development agreement with the plaintiff's production company. That agreement was properly executed, properly performed, and properly concluded. Any suggestion that this routine business transaction is somehow connected to decades-old employment disputes is pure fantasy. He sat down with the satisfied air of someone who had just delivered a knockout blow. The media representatives were furiously taking notes, several of them clearly impressed by Morrison's systematic destruction of Jasmine's dramatic presentation. Even Judge Chin seemed to be viewing the mysterious envelope with renewed skepticism. Whoopi allowed herself to relax slightly for the first time since entering the courtroom. Morrison had done exactly what she'd paid him to do: take a potentially explosive situation and reduce it to its component parts, showing how dramatic allegations could be explained through mundane realities. She'd seen him perform this kind of legal magic before, transforming scandal into misunderstanding, conspiracy into coincidence. But as Morrison concluded his opening statement, basking in the approving silence of a courtroom that seemed convinced by his arguments, none of them noticed the slight smile that played at the corners of Jasmine Rodriguez's lips. She'd listened to every word of Morrison's performance with the patience of someone who knew that confidence built on false foundations was the most dangerous kind of all. Because what Morrison didn't know, what Whoopi didn't know, what no one in that courtroom except Jasmine knew, was that Vincent Harrington's deathbed confession had included more than just old business records. Hidden within those files was a recording that would shatter every argument Morrison had just made, a piece of evidence so damning that it would prove beyond any doubt that this case was about much more than a simple contract dispute. The question that would drive viewers to the edge of their seats was this: if Morrison's defense seemed so convincing, so logically airtight, what could possibly be on that recording that would destroy not just his arguments, but the entire foundation of Whoopi's carefully constructed public image? Jasmine Rodriguez stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and calm despite the weight of what she was about to unleash. Morrison's confident defense had just painted her as a grieving daughter chasing conspiracy theories, but she'd expected that. In fact, she'd counted on it. Because the deeper someone digs their own grave with false confidence, the more devastating the fall becomes when the truth finally emerges. "Your Honor," Jasmine began, her voice steady as steel, "Mr. Morrison has painted a compelling picture of a simple business dispute and a disgruntled family seeking revenge. He's absolutely right about one thing: narrative is not evidence. So let me present evidence." She walked to her briefcase and pulled out a small digital recorder, the kind used for depositions and legal proceedings. This device contains a conversation that took place on November 15, 1999. The voices belonged to Vincent Harrington and Whoopi Goldberg. The courtroom's atmosphere shifted instantly. Morrison's confident smile faltered. Whoopi's hands, which had been resting calmly on the table, began to tremble slightly. Judge Chin leaned forward, her full attention now focused on the small device in Jasmine's hands. "Before I play this recording," Jasmine continued, "I need to provide context. 3 weeks before this conversation took place, my mother, Maria Rodriguez, witnessed something on the set of a television pilot called Neighborhood Stories. She saw Whoopi Goldberg and the show's executive producer, Michael Chin, engaged in a heated argument with a 15-year-old actor named David Martinez. This wasn't a creative disagreement. This was something much darker." Jasmine pressed play, and Vincent Harrington's voice filled the courtroom, clear and unmistakable despite the recording's age. "Whoopi, we have a problem. The script supervisor saw everything. She's threatening to go to the press." Whoopi's voice responded, just as clear, just as damning. "Then we make sure she doesn't. Vincent, that kid was asking for it. You saw how he was dressed, how he was acting. We were just giving him career advice." The courtroom erupted in gasps and whispered conversations, but Jasmine held up her hand for silence. The recording continued. Vincent's voice. "Maria Rodriguez isn't going to sign the NDA. She wants the boy's family contacted, wants them to know what happened." Whoopi's voice, harder now, more calculated. "Then we destroy her. Blacklist her from every production in this city. Make sure she never works in this industry again. And Vincent, if she tries to go public, we use the photos from Michael's party last year. She was drinking, she was laughing, she was having a good time. We spin it that she's unstable, looking for attention." The silence that followed was deafening. Morrison sat frozen, his face pale. Whoopi stared at the recorder as if it were a poisonous snake. Judge Chen's expression had transformed from skeptical to horrified. But Jasmine wasn't finished. David Martinez committed suicide 6 months after this conversation. He left a note saying he couldn't live with what had happened to him on that set, and he couldn't bear that no one believed him when he tried to tell his story. She pulled out a photograph and placed it on the evidence table. "This is David Martinez. He was 15 years old when he died. He'd been acting since he was 8, supporting his family, dreaming of a career in entertainment. According to the police report, he overdosed on pills he'd stolen from his mother's medicine cabinet." Jasmine's voice remained steady, but there was steel beneath the calm. "The conversation you just heard took place because my mother refused to participate in covering up what she witnessed. She saw Whoopi Goldberg and Michael Chin cornering David in his dressing room. She heard him crying, heard him saying no, heard them telling him that this was how the business worked, and he needed to learn to play along if he wanted to keep working." The recording device seemed to glow with malevolent energy on the evidence table. Morrison finally found his voice. "Your Honor, this is clearly fabricated. Voice technology today can—" "Mr. Morrison," Judge Chin interrupted, her voice sharp with authority. "I've heard enough objections for now. Ms. Rodriguez, do you have authentication for this recording?" Jasmine nodded and pulled out another document. Vincent Harrington's assistant, Patricia Wells, was present when this conversation was recorded. She's prepared to testify that Mr. Harrington recorded all his phone conversations as standard business practice. She personally labeled and filed this recording in his private safe. Here's her sworn affidavit. Furthermore, Jasmine continued, the cover-up didn't end with destroying my mother's career. David Martinez's family was paid a substantial settlement to sign a non-disclosure agreement about his death. The television pilot was immediately canceled, all footage was destroyed, and everyone involved was relocated to different projects. Michael Chin suddenly received a development deal with a major network. Whoopi's career, of course, continued to flourish. She pulled out a series of financial documents. These are bank records showing payments from Vincent Harrington's accounts to the Martinez family, to my mother's landlord to break her lease and force her to leave Los Angeles, and to 3 other crew members who witnessed various parts of what happened that day. Whoopi finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "That recording is taken out of context. We were discussing." "Ms. Goldberg," Judge Chen said firmly, "you'll have your opportunity to respond through your attorney." But Morrison looked like a man who'd just watched his entire strategy collapse in real time. The confident defense he'd built around grieving daughters and conspiracy theories had just been demolished by evidence he couldn't explain away or discredit. Jasmine walked closer to the judge's bench. "Your Honor, this case was never about a simple contract dispute. It was about getting Whoopi Goldberg into a courtroom where the truth could finally be told. My client's production company exists for one purpose: to seek justice for David Martinez and to hold accountable those who destroyed lives to protect their careers." She turned to face Whoopi directly for the first time. "You've built a career on speaking truth to power, on defending the vulnerable, on calling out injustice. But 23 years ago, you were the power that needed to be spoken to. You were the one who silenced a vulnerable boy who needed defending." The courtroom was completely silent except for the sound of reporters frantically typing on their devices. Judge Chen stared at the recording device as if it contained the power to rewrite history, which, in a way, it did. But even as the devastating recording echoed in everyone's minds, Jasmine knew that what she'd just revealed was only the beginning. Hidden in Vincent Harrington's files were documents that would prove this wasn't an isolated incident, that there had been other victims, other cover-ups, other lives destroyed to protect powerful people's reputations. The question that would keep viewers desperately clicking to the next section was this: if a single recording could destroy Whoopi's carefully crafted image so completely, what other secrets were still hidden in those files, and how many more victims had been silenced by the very people who claimed to champion justice and truth? Judge Margaret Chen had presided over thousands of cases in her 20-year career. She'd seen murder confessions, corporate fraud exposures, and family secrets that destroyed dynasties. But nothing had prepared her for the moment when Jasmine Rodriguez's recording finished playing and the courtroom fell into a silence, so complete it felt like the world had stopped breathing. The judge's jaw didn't just drop. It seemed to disconnect from her face entirely. Her hands, which had been folded professionally on the bench, now gripped the edge so tightly her knuckles had turned white. For 30 seconds that felt like an eternity, she simply stared at the digital recorder as if it were evidence of something supernatural rather than something all too human. "In 20 years on this bench," Judge Chen finally whispered, her voice barely audible, "I have never—" She stopped, cleared her throat, and tried again. "I have never heard evidence that so completely transforms a case from civil dispute to—" She paused again, searching for words that could adequately describe what had just been revealed. "To something that demands immediate criminal investigation." The chaos erupted like a dam bursting. Morrison jumped to his feet, so quickly his chair toppled backward, crashing to the floor with a sound that made everyone in the courtroom flinch. "Your Honor, this is clearly a fabrication. Voice synthesis technology can create—" "Sit down." Judge Chen's voice exploded with an authority that silenced the entire room instantly. Morrison froze mid-sentence, his face flushed with panic and disbelief. "Mr. Morrison, your client just admitted on a 23-year-old recording to covering up what appears to be the sexual assault of a minor. Your concerns about voice synthesis are noted and completely irrelevant." Whoopi had gone completely pale, her trademark confidence evaporating like morning mist. She reached across the table toward Morrison with a trembling hand, but he was too stunned to notice. Her carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time, broadcast live to millions of people who had trusted her, believed in her, seen her as a champion of truth and justice. The media section had transformed into barely controlled chaos. Reporters were typing frantically, their fingers flying across keyboards as they tried to capture every word of the historic moment. Camera operators were adjusting angles, knowing they were documenting what would become one of the most significant courtroom revelations in entertainment history. One veteran court reporter, who had covered celebrity trials for 30 years, was openly weeping as she transcribed the proceedings. Furthermore, Judge Chen continued, her voice gaining strength as her shock transformed into judicial determination. "This court is immediately issuing a preservation order for all evidence related to this matter. I am also ordering that copies of all materials presented today be forwarded to the District Attorney's Office for criminal investigation. Morrison found his voice again, desperation replacing his earlier confidence. Your Honor, my client invokes her Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. We respectfully request an immediate recess to Mr. Morrison. Judge Chin interrupted, her tone carrying the weight of absolute authority. Your client's constitutional rights are noted and protected. However, this civil proceeding will continue as scheduled. If Ms. Goldberg chooses not to testify, that is her right. But this court will hear all evidence that Ms. Rodriguez wishes to present. Jasmine stood calmly at her table, watching the controlled destruction of everything Whoopi had built. But her expression wasn't triumphant. It was sad, almost mournful. Your Honor, before we proceed, I think the court should know that David Martinez wasn't the only victim. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't shock, it was horror. Because everyone in the room suddenly understood that what they'd just heard wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern. How many others? Judge Chin asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jasmine opened another folder, this one thicker than the rest. Vincent Harrington's files document at least 6 other incidents over a 15-year period. Different productions, different young actors, but the same pattern of abuse followed by systematic cover-ups. Whoopi made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Morrison grabbed her arm, whispering urgently in her ear, but she seemed beyond hearing him. The weight of decades of hidden crimes was finally crushing down on her, and there was nowhere left to hide. Your Honor, Jasmine continued, with the court's permission, I'd like to read the names of the other victims. She pulled out a single sheet of paper, and the courtroom held its breath. David Martinez, age 15. Rebecca Chun, age 14. Marcus Williams, age 16. Sarah Lopez, age 15. Tommy Rodriguez, no relation to my family, age 14. And Lisa Park, age 13. Each name landed like a physical blow. Judge Chin closed her eyes, her face etched with pain and disbelief. In the gallery, several people were openly crying. The weight of 6 young lives destroyed by systematic abuse and cover-ups was almost too much for the room to bear. 3 of these children committed suicide within 2 years of their incidents, Jasmine said, her voice steady but heavy with emotion. The others were paid substantial settlements in exchange for their silence and disappeared from the entertainment industry entirely. Morrison was frantically scribbling notes, his confident demeanor completely shattered. Whoopi sat motionless, staring at her hands as if she could somehow make herself disappear. The confident celebrity who had walked into court expecting a routine victory had become a broken woman facing the exposure of decades of horrific secrets. Judge Chin finally opened her eyes and looked directly at Whoopi. Ms. Goldberg, do you wish to make any statement at this time? Whoopi's voice, when it finally came, was barely audible. I need to speak with my attorney. Of course, Judge Chin replied. This court is in recess for 15 minutes. When we return, Ms. Rodriguez, you will present any additional evidence you have. And I want to be clear, this courtroom is now under a complete media seal until further notice. As the judge left the bench, the courtroom erupted in controlled chaos. Whoopi's legal team huddled around her like bodyguards protecting a wounded celebrity. Reporters were being escorted out by bailiffs, their protests echoing through the hallway. And Jasmine Rodriguez stood quietly at her table, organizing her files with the methodical precision of someone who knew that the hardest part was still ahead. Because what no one in that courtroom realized was that Vincent Harrington's files contained one final revelation that would make everything they'd heard so far seem like a minor transgression. Hidden among the documents was evidence that would prove the cover-up had reached the highest levels of government, involving politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials who had been paid to look the other way. The question that would drive viewers to frantically search for the next section was this: if the revelation of 6 young victims had destroyed Whoopi's defense so completely, what could possibly be so much worse that it would shake the foundations of power itself? And who else would fall when Jasmine finally revealed the full scope of the conspiracy that had protected these monsters for over 2 decades? The 15-minute recess turned into the longest quarter hour in media history. Within minutes of the courtroom being sealed, leaked audio from the hearing had already hit social media like a digital tsunami. Someone with a hidden recording device had captured Jasmine's bombshell revelation, and now Vincent Harrington's explosive recording was racing across the internet at the speed of outrage. The hashtag Whoopi Exposed exploded across Twitter, gaining over 2 million mentions in the first hour. Instagram stories flooded with shocked reactions from celebrities, politicians, and ordinary people who couldn't believe what they were hearing. TikTok users were creating reaction videos faster than the platform could process them, their faces showing the same horror and disbelief that had paralyzed the courtroom. Outside the courthouse, what had started as a handful of reporters had grown into a media circus that stretched for 3 city blocks. News vans from every major network lined the street, their satellite dishes pointing skyward like mechanical flowers reaching for the sun. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and even international outlets had dispatched their top correspondents, all trying to be the first to break additional details of the story that was rewriting entertainment history in real time. Sarah Chun, a young reporter from Entertainment Tonight, was broadcasting live when her producer's voice crackled through her earpiece. "Sarah, we're getting reports that 3 more celebrities are lawyering up right now. This thing is spreading beyond just Whoopi." Her face went pale as she processed the information. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're now hearing that this scandal may involve other A-list celebrities who haven't been named yet." Inside a Manhattan penthouse, 3 powerful entertainment executives were watching the news coverage with growing terror. Michael Chun, the producer who had been mentioned in the recording, was pacing frantically while his crisis management team worked the phones. "How is this possible?" he kept repeating. Vincent swore those recordings were destroyed decades ago. His publicist, Rachel Stone, looked up from her laptop with grim news. "Michael, your name is trending worldwide. There are already calls for criminal investigations. NBC just released a statement saying they're reviewing all past associations with you." She paused, scrolling through more alerts. 3 of your current projects have been suspended pending investigation. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, talent agencies were in full crisis mode. The William Morris Agency convened an emergency meeting at 3 a.m. Pacific Time, trying to assess which of their clients might be connected to the expanding scandal. Agents were frantically calling their biggest stars, warning them to prepare statements, hire criminal attorneys, and brace for what one executive called the entertainment industry's 9/11. But the most shocking reaction came from an unexpected source. In a modest apartment in Brooklyn, 28-year-old Marcus Williams was watching the news coverage with tears streaming down his face. Marcus had been 16 when he was victimized on a film set, and he'd spent 12 years believing he was the only one, that he was crazy, that no one would ever believe his story. His hands shaking, Marcus picked up his phone and called his sister. "Jessica," he whispered, "are you watching the news?" She said my name. In court. Someone finally said my name. His sister, who had watched her brother struggle with depression and PTSD for over a decade, began crying on the other end of the line. "Marcus, baby, the whole world knows now. You're not alone anymore." Within hours, Marcus's phone was ringing constantly. Reporters, attorneys, and advocacy groups were all trying to reach him, but he wasn't ready to talk. Instead, he posted a single message on his Twitter account. "My name is Marcus Williams. I was 16. What Jasmine Rodriguez said in court today is true. I'm not ready to talk yet, but I'm ready to heal." The post was retweeted 400,000 times in the first hour. Back at the courthouse, Whoopi's crisis management team was working frantically to control the narrative, but they were fighting a losing battle against the speed of social media. Her longtime publicist, David Ross, was fielding calls from major media outlets, all demanding statements, explanations, and exclusive interviews. David called a voice from across their makeshift command center. The View just released a statement. They're suspending Whoopi indefinitely pending investigation. Another voice chimed in. Her book deal just got canceled. The publisher is demanding the advance money back. A third voice, barely audible over the chaos. 3 different streaming services just pulled her specials from their platforms. The financial implications were staggering. Whoopi's net worth was estimated at $60 million, but her earning potential had just evaporated in a matter of hours. Endorsement deals, speaking engagements, and future projects were disappearing faster than her team could track them. But perhaps the most devastating reaction came from her own industry peers. Celebrities who had worked with Whoopi for decades were distancing themselves with carefully crafted statements. Oprah Winfrey's team released a brief comment. "We are deeply disturbed by these allegations and stand with all survivors of abuse." Ellen DeGeneres posted on Instagram, "My heart breaks for the victims who have suffered in silence." The silence from her closest friends was even more damning than the public statements. Phone calls went unreturned. Text messages were ignored. The protective bubble of celebrity friendship that had surrounded Whoopi for decades had burst, leaving her isolated and defenseless. In Hollywood, emergency meetings were happening in boardrooms across the city. Studio executives were reviewing every project that had involved Whoopi, Vincent Harrington, or Michael Chin. Legal departments were working overtime to assess potential liability, while public relations teams crafted statements that would distance their companies from the growing scandal. One anonymous studio executive told a reporter, "This isn't just about Whoopi anymore. This is about a systemic failure that allowed predators to operate with impunity for decades. Every major studio, every major agency, every major production company is going to have to answer questions about what they knew and when they knew it." The international reaction was equally swift and brutal. The BBC canceled a planned documentary about Whoopi's career. French television networks pulled her films from their schedules. Even in Japan, where her popularity had remained strong for decades, major retailers began removing her merchandise from their shelves. But amid all the chaos and condemnation, a different kind of movement was beginning to emerge. Survivors of abuse in the entertainment industry were finding their voices, inspired by Jasmine Rodriguez's courage and the validation that their stories might finally be believed. A support group that had been meeting quietly in Los Angeles for years suddenly found their membership growing exponentially. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the therapist who ran the group, told reporters, "For years, these survivors have been told they were lying, that they were seeking attention, that no one would believe them. Today, everything changed. Today, they realized they were never alone." As the courthouse clock struck 4 p.m., indicating that the recess was about to end, the media frenzy showed no signs of slowing down. If anything, it was accelerating, driven by hints that more revelations were coming, that more names would be named, that the conspiracy Jasmine had exposed was far larger than anyone had imagined. The question that was driving millions of people to refresh their news feeds obsessively was this: if the exposure of Whoopi Goldberg had triggered this massive earthquake in the entertainment industry, what would happen when Jasmine Rodriguez revealed to politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials who had helped cover up these crimes for decades? And how high up the ladder of power did this conspiracy? When court reconvened, the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. What had started as a civil lawsuit had transformed into something that felt more like a war crimes tribunal. Judge Chen returned to the bench with the weight of history on her shoulders, knowing that whatever happened next would define not just this case, but potentially reshape how justice worked in America. Jasmine Rodriguez stood up with a thick manila folder in her hands, but this time her usual calm demeanor carried something different, a sense of profound responsibility. "Your Honor, what I'm about to present will explain how a conspiracy involving the abuse of children was protected by some of the most powerful people in this country for over 2 decades. She opened the folder and pulled out a series of photographs. These are images from Vincent Harrington's private safe. They show a meeting that took place in December 1999, 1 month after David Martinez's death, at a private estate in the Hamptons. She placed the first photograph on the evidence table. This meeting included Whoopi Goldberg, Michael Chen, Vincent Harrington, and 3 other individuals. The courtroom leaned forward as she identified the other faces. Senator Richard Hayes, who at the time was chairman of the Senate Subcommittee on Media Oversight. District Attorney Paul Morrison, no relation to defense counsel, who was responsible for investigating entertainment industry crimes. And Judge William Carter, who had jurisdiction over family court cases involving child actors. The implications hit the room like a physical blow. Morrison sat frozen as he realized that a DA with his own last name had been part of the conspiracy. Judge Chen's face showed a mixture of disgust and disbelief as she processed the fact that a fellow judge had been involved in covering up child abuse. This wasn't just an entertainment industry cover-up, Jasmine continued, her voice steady but filled with controlled anger. This was a systematic conspiracy involving the 3 branches of government that are supposed to protect children. She pulled out more documents. Bank records show that Senator Hayes received $2.3 million in campaign contributions from shell companies controlled by Vincent Harrington between 2000 and 2010. The financial web was even more extensive than anyone had imagined. DA Morrison's office received substantial grants for youth protection programs that were never actually implemented. The money was diverted to personal accounts and used to finance luxury vacations and real estate purchases. She placed bank statements on the evidence table like playing cards in a deadly game. Judge Carter's involvement was perhaps the most insidious, Jasmine said, her voice growing harder. He was responsible for approving emancipation papers for child actors, removing them from their parents' protection, and making them more vulnerable to predators. In exchange, he received consulting fees from entertainment companies totaling over $1.8 million. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. Jasmine pulled out a leather-bound ledger that looked like something from a different era. This is Vincent Harrington's personal record book. It documents not just financial transactions, but specific services provided to protect the conspiracy. She opened to a page marked with a red tab. In 2003, when Rebecca Chen's parents tried to report their daughter's assault to police, the investigating detective was Detective Frank Sullivan. According to this ledger, Detective Sullivan received $75,000 to lose the case file and intimidate the family into silence. The courtroom was completely silent except for the sound of Judge Chen's pen scratching across her notepad as she documented each explosive revelation. Detective Sullivan was later promoted to captain and eventually became deputy commissioner of the LAPD. He retired with full benefits in 2018. Jasmine turned another page. When Marcus Williams tried to report his assault in 2007, the case was assigned to the same detective. This time, the payment was $125,000, and Marcus was arrested on false drug possession charges that mysteriously disappeared after he agreed to sign an NDA. The pattern was becoming clear, a network of corrupt officials at every level of government, all working together to protect predators and silence victims. This wasn't random corruption, Jasmine explained. This was a carefully orchestrated system designed to ensure that powerful people could abuse children without consequences. She pulled out the final document, and her hands trembled slightly as she held it. This is a memo from Senator Hayes to Vincent Harrington, dated January 2001. It outlines a strategy they called Project Guardian, a plan to place their allies in key positions throughout law enforcement and the judiciary to create a protective network for what they euphemistically called industry issues. Judge Chen looked up from her notes, her face pale. Ms. Rodriguez, are you telling this court that there was a deliberate conspiracy to infiltrate the justice system for the purpose of protecting child abusers? Yes, Your Honor. And it worked perfectly for over 20 years. Jasmine's voice carried the weight of profound sadness. 6 children died by suicide. Dozens more were traumatized and silenced. Hundreds of families were destroyed. And the people responsible not only escaped justice, they were rewarded with more power, more money, and more opportunities to enable future crimes. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. It reached from Hollywood studios to Senate committee rooms, from police precincts to judicial chambers. It involved millions of dollars in bribes, dozens of corrupted officials, and a systematic dismantling of the very institutions designed to protect the most vulnerable members of society. Morrison finally found his voice, but it was weak and desperate. Your Honor, these allegations are so broad, so sweeping, that they beggar belief. My client cannot be held responsible for the actions of government officials. Mr. Morrison, Judge Chin interrupted, her voice sharp with authority. Your client was at the center of this conspiracy. She participated in the meeting where it was planned, benefited from the protection it provided, and remained silent while children continued to be victimized. Whoopi had been silent throughout Jasmine's presentation, but now she finally spoke, her voice barely audible. I never wanted children to die. I never wanted anyone to get hurt. Jasmine turned to face her directly. But they did die, Ms. Goldberg. And every time you appeared on television talking about justice and protecting the vulnerable, you knew that you had helped create a system that did the opposite. The courtroom was engulfed in a silence that felt like the calm before a hurricane. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing the exposure of a conspiracy so vast and so evil that it would take years to fully understand its implications. But even as Jasmine revealed the depths of corruption that had protected these crimes, she knew that there was one final secret hidden in Vincent Harrington's files, evidence that would prove the conspiracy was still active, that it had evolved and adapted, and that powerful people were even now working to cover up new crimes and silence new victims. The question that would drive viewers to desperately seek the next section was this: if a conspiracy this massive had successfully operated for decades with complete impunity, what was happening right now to cover up the exposure, and which current government officials were at this very moment working to bury the truth that Jasmine Rodriguez had just brought into the light? Within 48 hours of Jasmine's bombshell revelations, the entertainment industry began collapsing like a house of cards in an earthquake. But this wasn't just about Hollywood anymore. This was about the complete breakdown of trust in American institutions. Senator Richard Hayes was found dead in his Georgetown study, an apparent suicide, with a note that simply read, "I'm sorry for what we allowed to happen." His death sent shockwaves through Washington, triggering immediate FBI investigations into every political figure mentioned in Vincent Harrington's files. Detective Frank Sullivan, the former LAPD captain who had buried evidence for decades, was arrested at his luxury retirement home in Malibu. As federal agents led him away in handcuffs, his neighbors, many of whom were entertainment industry executives, watched in horror, realizing that their own secrets might be next. Judge William Carter suffered a massive heart attack during an emergency ethics hearing. He survived, but his career was over. From his hospital bed, he released a statement through his attorney. "I've spent the last 23 years trying to forget what I did. I pray that God and the victims can forgive me." Whoopi Goldberg's world disintegrated completely. Her net worth plummeted from $60 million to virtually nothing as lawsuits, legal fees, and canceled contracts destroyed her empire. She was arrested on charges of conspiracy to obstruct justice and accessory to child abuse. Bail was denied. But the most shocking development came from an unexpected source. Marcus Williams, the young man who had been victimized at 16, stepped forward as the lead plaintiff in a massive class action lawsuit against not just the individual conspirators, but the entire system that had protected them. "This isn't about money," Marcus said at a press conference that was watched by over 100 million people worldwide. "This is about making sure that no child ever has to suffer in silence again because powerful people decided their careers were more important than children's lives." Within weeks, 17 more victims came forward, each with stories that followed the same horrific pattern of abuse, intimidation, and systematic cover-ups. Their testimonies triggered congressional hearings, FBI raids, and a complete overhaul of how child actors were protected in the entertainment industry. The ripple effects extended far beyond Hollywood. Police departments across the country launched internal investigations into cases that had been mysteriously closed or lost. Judicial ethics committees began reviewing judges who had handled entertainment industry cases. The entire entertainment regulatory system was dismantled and rebuilt from scratch. Vincent Harrington's files revealed one final, devastating truth: the conspiracy had evolved and was still active. Current government officials, including a sitting Supreme Court justice and 3 senators, were named as recent recipients of payments designed to influence legislation affecting child protection laws. The FBI raids that followed were unlike anything in American history. Simultaneous searches were conducted in Washington, Los Angeles, New York, and Atlanta. The evidence seized filled 17 warehouse facilities and implicated over 200 individuals in ongoing criminal activity. President Biden addressed the nation in a somber speech. What we have learned in recent days represents one of the darkest chapters in American history. We have allowed a system to exist that prioritized power and money over the safety of our children. This ends now. Jasmine Rodriguez became an unlikely national hero, but she paid a heavy price for her courage. Death threats forced her into protective custody. Her law practice was firebombed by unknown assailants. She was offered millions of dollars to stay quiet about additional evidence, offers she rejected without hesitation. "My mother spent 23 years waiting for justice," Jasmine said in her final press conference before entering witness protection. David Martinez and all the other children who died can't wait any longer. This fight doesn't end until every person responsible is held accountable. The documentary, The Harrington Files, which told the complete story of the conspiracy, became the most-watched film in streaming history. It won 7 Emmy Awards and sparked international investigations into similar networks of corruption and abuse. Hollywood itself transformed overnight. New protocols were established for child actors. Independent oversight committees were created. Mandatory reporting requirements were strengthened. The entire culture shifted from protecting predators to protecting victims. But perhaps the most lasting impact was on the victims themselves. Support groups formed across the country. Survivors found their voices and their power. Marcus Williams established the David Martinez Foundation, which provided legal support and counseling for abuse victims. Jasmine Rodriguez didn't just expose a conspiracy, Marcus said at the foundation's first annual gala. She proved that truth is more powerful than any amount of money or influence. She showed us that even the most carefully hidden secrets can't stay buried forever when someone is brave enough to dig them up. 3 years later, as Whoopi Goldberg was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, the judge's words echoed through a courtroom packed with survivors. "You used your platform to speak about justice while actively participating in its denial. You claimed to protect the vulnerable while systematically destroying them. History will remember you not for your career, but for your crimes." But even as justice was finally served, one question continued to haunt investigators and the public alike. If a conspiracy this massive could operate undetected for decades, what other networks of corruption and abuse were still hidden in the shadows, and who would have the courage to expose them when the next whistleblower's moment arrived? 5 years later, Jasmine Rodriguez stands before the Supreme Court, no longer the lone attorney with a worn briefcase, but a woman who changed history. Behind her sit Marcus Williams, Rebecca Chin, and Tommy Rodriguez, survivors who found their voices because one person refused to let them stay silent. The Rodriguez Act passed unanimously, establishing the strongest child protection laws in American history. Hollywood transformed completely, mandatory advocates, independent oversight, and safety protocols that prioritized children over profits. The entertainment industry's culture shifted so dramatically that silencing victims now seems as archaic as medieval torture. But Jasmine's impact reached far beyond courtrooms. The Rodriguez effect inspired whistleblowers across every industry. Healthcare workers exposed medical fraud, teachers reported abuse, corporate employees revealed environmental crimes. Her courage proved that individual action can still topple institutional corruption.